Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Paul, and in this Game Telecom video, we're going to be discussing and analysing tech news which, as usual, has popped up over the past 24 or so hours. We're going to be starting things out with Maxsun, who are an Nvidia AIDA partner. They, of course, produce various Geforce graphics cards and have also produced various 10 series cards, although they typically aim at the Chinese market. And they have actually teased a next-generation Geforce card at ChinaJoy. It is a triple fan design with dual slot model, as you would expect for a premium type of card. There are 4 LED strips, and perhaps most importantly of all, there is a single 8-pin power connector. There doesn't appear also to be a DVI connector as well. There is no model numbers available here, so we cannot see whether it's, for example, the 1180 series or the 2080 series. Personally, I don't really care on the naming, as I've mentioned multiple times before. I'm curious in the comments though, do you actually really care about the number? If so, which one are you rooting for? I guess technically 2080 sounds a little cooler, but I don't know, there's not really much in it for me. So why is it that I find this particular leak interesting? Well, assuming that this particular GPU rendition is accurate, the thing that's really puzzling me is the 8-pin power connector. You might recall just a short while ago there was a PCB, supposedly of the 2080 card, that leaked onto the internets. The interesting thing about that particular PCB is that it appeared to have both an 8 and a 6-pin power connector. So things don't quite add up, which means that there's a couple of questions here. One, is this particular card from Maxsun accurate? So for example, is it just an example of what we're going to be seeing? So does that mean there's a potential for it to have more power connectors in the future? Or was the PCB that we actually saw from Nvidia just like the highest end SKU possible? Perhaps this particular card also could be the 2070, which would be interesting. Normally they do show the 2080s in these type of mock-ups, renders or photos, but it's possible that that was just the one they had and maybe they didn't want to give away too much. Perhaps certain stuff is under NDA and they didn't want that information to go public yet. Either way, it's kind of fascinating and does lead additional questions. But of course, we should get most of those answered by around the 20th of August. Well, we expect all of this information and more most likely to be publicly available, and this does tie in, of course, with the news we had yesterday regarding the various trademarks from Nvidia, including Geforce RTX, but you can go ahead and check that video out from yesterday if you want more information of that. But I wouldn't be surprised if one of the reasons that we're seeing the delays for the 20 series, and this is pure speculation, not only do we have the million or so Geforce GPUs, which supposedly Nvidia have a back inventory of, but I also wouldn't be surprised if some of it is to do with the actual technology itself, and I don't just necessarily mean the hardware. It could be in some instances the software. So for example, it could be the RTX technology, it could be tweaks to GameWorks, it could be whatever. It could even be that they're waiting for developers to get a better handle of things and perhaps to do a few hardware tweaks. So either way, I'm really interested in the 20 launch, and I can't wait to see what the future of games is going to look like over the next couple of months. And perhaps really interesting to me, what about games like, let's say, Shadow of the Tomb Raider? Will this card, the 2080, be capable of playing those games maxed out, apart from things like super sampling and, you know, silly things like that, at 60 FPS, running at 4K? That's a question. Once again, let me know your thoughts on this. What type of performance would you expect from the 2080? Do you expect it to be roughly on par up with, let's say, the 1080 Ti, or do you expect even more? Are you expecting it to be like a little slower? You know, let me know. So we also have another piece of news concerning Nvidia's next generation cards, and this one comes to us through AIDA 64, specifically an update to the application. And get ready, we're adding more confusion because it appears that this particular update alleges that the cards are going to have the G-V naming convention, which of course means Volta, and secondly that we're going to be seeing these cards called the 11 series. So once again, AIDA 64 has just been updated and we see 5.97.4679, that's a beta version, and it just rolls off the tongue, that version number, doesn't it? And we see mention of the GV102, GV102GL, GV104 and GV104M. Now it's worth noting that these naming conventions, and as well as the device IDs, we'll get to that in just a second, are very similar to rumours we had previously from laptop to media to go. And their particular entries were based on rumours, so the fact that we see it in AIDA 64 is not necessarily confirmation of anything. It could just be that they decided to add it because they've seen it in other software, so they decided, hey, let's just add it into the changelog. It doesn't necessarily mean that they have received confirmation from Nvidia themselves, so that's really important for us to be aware of. And we can see that the GV104 chip has a device ID of 1E87, and that is being listed as the GTX 1180. And once again, this is exactly the same as what we saw from laptop to media to go. So onevideocards.com, it's worth noting, actually contacted laptop to media to go, which is kind of a lengthy name, and asked them to clarify whether these were rumours or whether they had heard some type of confirmation. They had said that this was based on rumours and from what they'd heard. So it's hard to know whether AIDA 64 has actually really gotten this information, whether it's just a rumour or whether it's actually accurate or not. So what I'm doing is just letting you guys know so you have the information so you can either be skeptical or kind of do your own due diligence, because I think that's really important. But just a quick refresher, just in case you are unfamiliar. Of course, this means that at least one of these is going to most likely be a Quadro card. The fact that it's listed as V means one of two things. One, it is essentially Volta. So what does that mean? Well, it could just be Volta, but with just a different memory controller. Another possibility is Volta technically, but is kind of like a distant brother. What does that mean? Well, it could be that it is Volta, but with some significant changes. And I don't just mean like the obvious ones, such as, let's say, number of tensor cores cut down and not having HBM2. It could be that they've changed the configuration of like the ROPs or the level 2 cache, or it could be they've changed how CUDA cores work, or it could be that they've really changed a couple of the actual things inside the core to really ramp up the clock speed or whatever. Who the heck knows? Because obviously I'm not Nvidia, I'm not peeking over their shoulder and being like, you know, using a magnifying glass looking to see their actual design right now. So this is pure speculation on my part. But it is possibly the reason that it is being listed as Geforce Volta. And Volta now, of course, is a little bit older, so it might make sense for them to start trickling it and changing it for the gaming market. But once again, this is purely a theory. You might recall another piece of news that we covered just a few days ago as well, and that is the Sabor console, which is being created primarily, once again, for the Chinese market. This is a collaboration with Sabol, but also AMD themselves. And what we see here is an APU, which is pretty terrific in design. It features 24 Vega GPU cores, or 24 CUs technically, along with a 3 GHz Zen processor, which has 4 cores, 8 threads. But now we have further details which have emerged on this particular console, and it is looking really impressive. So first of all, we have an actual PCB shot which shows the chip itself, and this emerges thanks to chip hell, and you can see the various GDDR5 memory modules surrounding the rather large, rather hefty chip. On top of that, we have further some information, on the specifications of this particular console. So yes, it's a 256-bit bus memory interface, and it looks like the console itself has 256 gigabytes per second of memory bandwidth. That's pretty damn good, and it does make sense given Vega and the number of GPU compute units that we have here, plus of course the Zen processor. Once again, the GPU core clock of this console is running at 1300 megahertz. So just a quick overview of the specifications. 4 Ryzen CPU cores, 3 GHz simultaneous multi-threading, so we have 8 threads total. We have 24 Vega compute units running at 1300 megahertz, which means 4 teraflops of GPU performance, 8 gigabytes of GDDR5 memory running at 8 Gbps on a 256-bit bus, so 256 gigabytes per second of memory bandwidth. And there are 2 operating system options. The first is Windows 10. The second is Windows 10 with a Z Plus custom interface. It's not quite clear how that works. I wouldn't be surprised if it was something like Steam machines. I'll get to that in a second. There's low power mode supported with a 30-watt background download design. It has a 4.9 litre body. There's a built-in power supply and excellent heat dissipation, whatever that means. It runs at 33 dB at full horsepower. There's various customizable designs. It has built-in Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and so on and so on. There's a 128 GB M2 drive, which is included, and you also have an optional 1 TB hard drive, which I suspect you probably would want to include, or some type of external, because 128 GB is bupkis. Audio stack supports SP DIF, HDMI 2.0 is supported, and we also see support for 4 USB 3.0 ports and 2 USB 2.0 ports. So if you actually do a conversion of currency, this console, this system is worth around $600 US, which is kind of pricey. So it'll be interesting to see exactly how it fares in the market. There are actually some reports and some theories that we could see the APU being a variant of the so-called Feng Huang design that has been teased and rumoured for so long from AMD. Of course, there is not enough information yet. If so, it would be slightly cut down, because Feng Huang, from what we understand, has 28 compute units. So it's possible it's slightly just been cut back for this particular console. There are numerous thoughts I have with this. The first is, once again, it probably paints a rough picture of what we're going to see for the next generation of consoles from both Microsoft and Sony. Of course, there'll probably be some major changes, specifically on the GPU. We already know the Xbox One X's GPU significantly outpaces the one we see here, and most likely it will be a later version of the GCN architecture, or maybe not GCN. We don't even know really what Microsoft have. Sony, of course, are using Navi, whatever that means. After all, we don't really know the specifics of what Navi even is. For all we know, it could just be Vega with an extra 1 KB of level 2 cache. Of course, I'm being silly, but you get what I'm saying. As for my thoughts on this, the more and more I'm thinking about this, the more and more I think that something like this would have been amazing if Valve had really supported it. And obviously what I refer to here is the whole Steam machine things. In fact, a friend and I were actually going backwards and forwards on WhatsApp. He knows who he is if he's watching. And I was like, you know, you're so right. Like, if Valve had really pushed this with the Steam OS and really pushed it for games, as particularly now, I mean, now is like the perfect time, now that Vulkan is starting to move forward. Valve, of course, are a proponent of Vulkan. I know, it's not that I have anything against Microsoft, it's not that I have anything against Windows, it's not that I have anything against DirectX 12, far from it. I'm actually a really big fan of DirectX 12, and I think it's done wonders for the industry, and I really like Microsoft's ecosystem as a whole. I'm not even that against Windows Store. It's not, I mean, I do kind of grumble, but it's not that I hate it with a burning passion. But the fact of the matter is, at least for my money, I would have loved Microsoft to have some type of competitor, a real competitor, and for Valve to have really given them a kick in the butt. However, it just doesn't seem to be the case, and honestly, that would be really cool for these type of variants and for them really to have pushed the machine. So that's just another thing that I kind of did think of in regards to this particular console. Either way, in my opinion, it's really interesting. I would love to have seen it to be slightly different. I would like to see what type of games we're going to see created for this. It seems that it's just essentially like a Windows-based console, so obviously it probably won't have necessarily super platform exclusives like we see with, let's say, the Xbox, but still, for the pricing and the specifications, it's not too bad. 40 flops of compute performance is looking at around the performance of, let's say, RX 570 maybe, obviously depending on the rest of the system as well, but still, it looks pretty darn cool. And now we're going to finish the video off with further Threadripper 2 stuff. So, a website by the name of Kit Guru has actually released yet further slides which were not part of the press deck that got released yesterday for Threadripper 2. And what we have here is yet further information on the performance of these processors. We'll go into it in just a second, but just to reconfirm what I said yesterday, these processors look insane value for money. you have to remember that they are competing against Skylake-x. So Intel will be releasing its next generation processors, of course, over the next coming months. So that may shake things up a bit, and of course Intel do have the option to drop the pricing, either for its current lineup of SKUs or for future products. So it is hard to say that Threadripper 2 is going to just decimate Intel in the long term. After all, we don't have that many benchmarks, right? I mean, I'm not saying AMD are lying, far from it. I'm pretty darn sure that they are being accurate with their benchmarks. I know from working with the company in the past, and just from working with various hardware vendors, typically, if they do release a product and they say that it scores X number in a particular application, if you are running hardware similar to that, it probably does represent that. But of course, I'm curious in the grander scheme of things. So what type of information do we have here? So one of the things we see is that AMD are obviously marketing the 2950X, which is 16 cores, as more like media, visual, modeling, and rigging. But the WX, the 2990, is more specifically for coding. It's more for data science. It's more machine learning. So what we have basically is AMD utilizing the X399 platform in a very smart way. That's my personal opinion. But what we have is them targeting a variety of different individuals. So let's say you're a gamer who does, let's say, video encoding on the side. And you might not be a streamer, you might just do video encoding and perhaps want to do a few other bits and pieces. Maybe you do a little bit of modeling. Maybe you're an aspiring 3D artist, right? Well, in which case, the 2950X would probably be the processor for you, because you have enough PCI slots, you've got enough performance, you've got enough cores, and of course you've got as much memory support as realistically you're ever going to put in a machine. After all, it does support up to 1 TB if memory serves, which is like, come on now. I don't really think many people are going to be having that in their machines. But let's say that you are also someone who needs more. Maybe you're a compiler. Maybe you're someone who does an awful lot of virtual machine work. Maybe you're running an SME. So perhaps you want to get the 2990WX to service 2 or 3 3D artists, or maybe 1 3D artist, 1 video compositor, and 1, let's say, programmer. So this would be an awesome processor in that instance. Once again, you've got enough PCIe lanes, you've got a lot of memory bandwidth thanks to quad channel memory. Yes, it's not as high as EPYC, but that's not necessarily a problem. It's like, okay, you're not as fast as EPYC, but EPYC costs more money, so it's totally different markets. It's like, you know, they're not competing against one another. What AMD have done here is really smart, in my opinion. Once again, they've produced processors which go across a myriad of different applications and a myriad of different price points to satisfy everyone from just a lower end HEDT user, if you can call it that, all the way down to someone who perhaps wants to model something very specific with large volumes of data. So what about performance? Well, according to the Ryzen Threadripper processor performance we see in a slide, this is 32 cores versus an i9 18 core. We can see performance does vary. It's about the same performance with Maya, all the way up to 88% faster with Monte Carlo, which of course is more of a financial simulator. Performance does vary, and around 28%, 21% does seem to be very typical from what a lot of the applications AMD are showcasing here, which is really impressive. Of course, you do have 18 cores versus 32 cores, but you also have to take into consideration the clock speed advantage that Intel does have quite frequently, and the fact that some applications are just plumb better optimized most likely for Intel processors, and also not all applications will scale so linearly with additional cores. So for example, if you have let's say a 32 core processor, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be double the speed as, let's say, a 16 core processor, because that application may be constrained with other limits like memory bandwidth, or it just might not be that great at being parallel over so many threads, 64 threads in theory. But what is really impressive to me is the 16 core Gen 1 to Gen 2. So what we're of course referring to here is the 1950X versus the 2950X. So once again, 16 cores, 32 threads versus 16 cores, 32 threads, AMD versus AMD. According to AMD's own benchmark, performance scaling is really impressive. You're looking depending once again on application, anything between a couple of percent, let's say 5% up to 25% faster. This of course is primarily due to clock speed, but you've also got other enhancements on the core. Some of this we're going to go into in just a moment, but of course you're also looking at the Zen Plus architecture anyway, and Zen Plus, as we know from our own testing and AMD themselves, you're looking at around 3 to 5% performance advantage at the same clock speed, in other words IPC gains. We also see further information from AMD of UMA versus NUMA, the Ryzen Master Control Panel, and other such changes. Of course, we're going to cover this much more in depth when we actually get our own review sample of this particular board. So we're going to hold off just now, just in case there's more information that hasn't been provided in these slides before we do a full in-depth analysis on how all of this works. But do know that it is coming, and with all of that said, hopefully you have enjoyed the video. Take care of yourselves, and thanks for watching. Bye for now.